Hello, my loves. Welcome back to another episode of Unfollowing Mum. How are you? Have you had a good Easter break? You might have noticed that we haven't had an episode of Unfollowing Mum over Easter. Have taken a little bit of a break during that period, especially while my kids have been off so that I can spend some time with them. And now we're back. I'm absolutely gobsmacked that today is episode 50. That feels like a huge thing. I didn't, when I started this, expect to have such a huge reaction to it. And I think that speaks to how alone you can feel in these circumstances. I didn't realise that there would be so many people out there who shared similar experiences to me, who wanted to be involved in the podcast, whether they be as professionals or whether they come on and share their lived experience stories, which you're always welcome to do. I didn't think that this was going to be something that was so relatable for so many people. I just thought that I was going to be, waffling out there to a few people. And then gradually, as I realised how many people have experienced this, I feel so honoured to be a part of helping you to heal and to help yourself, because in turn that's really healing for me, and finding this community has been so important for me. That kind of leads me into where I wanted to go with today's episode, and it's a bit of a raw one for me, and I'm still processing it. I'm still dealing with a lot of it, but I wanted to talk today about late ADHD and autism assessments, especially when you have had a toxic parent. And I think we've briefly touched on this in a few other episodes. I know on episode 9, when I spoke to Elspeth Vanderhol, she spoke a lot about her experiences of childhood trauma and neurodivergency as she'd got older. But the reason that this has come up for me and why this is an episode that I wanted to talk about, I've recently been involved in an assessment for someone else. And while speaking to the psychiatrist on the phone, learning about whether or not I should look at an autism assessment or an ADHD assessment for this person and how I can best support whilst I'm going through that process, they listed off a load of symptoms and signs of someone who has ADHD. And I'd sort of jokingly said, oh, well, that doesn't sound like them, but it does sound like me. Anyway, we're not here to talk about me. I've got a lot of trauma, so I know that that's what that is. It's my CPTSD, it's my trauma. And the psychiatrist said, well, actually, did you know that a lot of those overlap? And I know that. And he said, but some of them don't. And what we've discovered is that a lot of people who are now perhaps in their 30s, 40s, 50s, especially women, are undiagnosed and have ADHD or are autistic. But especially because so many of those people had very traumatic childhoods because they were what their parents might have called difficult or different, but were actually neurodiverse, it's gone overlooked and they've never been given an assessment unless you were non-verbal. Unless you were what the media portrays as autistic, you were a Sheldon or from Big Bang Theory, or you were someone who rocked in a corner, unless they could point out that there was something quote unquote wrong with you, which there's nothing wrong with someone neurodivergent, but that is how it was viewed 30, 40, 50 years ago, even 20 years ago. Unless you could have that put out about you, you were just different or difficult or a bit weird. And a lot of the things that he mentioned, he also said for ADHD in particular in women, the signs start to present much more prevalently as they get to the period of perimenopause or they get into their later years when they are menopausal. And it was like a light bulb moment for me. Later on, undergoing another part of this assessment process, one of the questions was, is anyone within the family neurodivergent? And both of the people that I was with pointed at me and said, well, after speaking to the psychiatrist prior to this assessment, it looks like she might be. And we were joking and we were laughing and smiling. And that psychiatrist said, I've actually written your name down, but I just wanted to know whether or not you knew you were neurodivergent. And it was like, what? This feels... Okay, so in two parts, this feels really odd because I've been looking at a lot of my childhood experience through the lens of trauma. And I've been looking at a lot of my experiences and the way that I have conducted myself through my childhood and then my adolescence and then into my early to late 20s and early 30s. I've been looking at those with, okay, I have a lot of trauma that I carry that I'm having to navigate, that I'm having to work through. We've talked so many times about the lack of identity, the lack of sense of self that you have when you are raised by a toxic parent. And now, after having been sent a pre-screening for ADHD that came back moderate to severe and in desperate need of an actual assessment and diagnosis, I am pending diagnosis for ADHD and autism. And I mean, when I say pending, I could be pending that bad boy for 4 or 5 years because the assessment process is so lengthy. But if I look at things through a neurodivergent lens, as so many of us who have experienced childhood trauma and who have experienced toxic parents perhaps have to do at some point because we were so overlooked and dismissed, it feels really strange. There's a part of me that feels like I've spent the last 4 or 5 years really doing so much self-reflection, striving to develop a sense of identity that I was denied, striving to understand who I am on a fundamental level, a lot of which is wrapped up in a ball of trauma. And I'm having to unpick that and unlearn that and relearn how to be who I want to be, not who my mum tells me I should be. And now I'm looking at it and thinking, well, is that me or was I masked? And how much of that have I masked? And it was really interesting reading all of these things about autism and ADHD and how many of us are undiagnosed. Through my age group, I'm 35, but you speak to any professional who works with people who have ADHD, who have autism, and they will tell you that the majority of people 30 and upwards are most likely undiagnosed, especially if they are women, because it was just passed off as that kid's naughty, that kid's difficult. And I look back at my experiences and yes, this is the other thing. Some of them will have absolutely been amplified by the trauma of what I was experiencing at home and the fraction between my parents, the way that my mum behaved, the treatment that I was receiving. But actually, the overwhelm that I would experience in class, the way that I couldn't, so when I was about 9 to 10 years old, I couldn't go to one of my schools. My primary school shut down and I loved that place and I felt really safe there. For the most part, I'm saying I felt really safe. Then a memory just popped up for me of me walking out of that school and trying to walk myself home at the age of about 7 because I was being picked on by another kid and I didn't like it anymore. So I said, fuck it, I'm going home. So was I safe there? Yes, I was. But there was an element of me feeling, I always did things like that. And looking at them through the lens of, okay, is that neurodivergency? Maybe it is. And filling out all of these forms for someone else who's undergoing the assessment, thinking to myself, that sounds like me. What I was going to say about the school that shut down, that I did feel safe at, when I had this big change to go to another school, and I've spoken about it on the podcast before, of how my mum bigged up the secondary school, but there was a year overlap and I had to go to this other school. I hated that one, but I had no reason to. But I just remember crying every single day for almost a year, to the point where the teachers would end up screaming at me. All of the kids thought I was a weirdo and I couldn't control it. And I've put that very much down to, you were experiencing a lot of trauma at that time. You were 9, 10 years old. That's kind of when all these hormones are starting to ping pong. You've maybe just come out of that adrenarche phase that you have between 7 and 8 that mirrors your teen years and a hormonal surge. No wonder you were like that. And then if you think about it, from the perspective of someone who is neurodivergent, who's had a big unplanned for change, who can't regulate their emotions at all, and on top of this is going through trauma, it makes so much sense. And I remember things like during that period when I would become very overwhelmed, banging my head on a desk so that the rest of the class would shut up. That's not something of someone who is regulated. But it's a big flashing red light of, okay, this child's really struggling. And whether it was trauma or whether it was neurodivergence or a big cocktail of both, which is what I now suspect, how was it missed? How was that missed? How unfair does that feel in my 30s as a responsible adult for myself, having to pick these experiences and reflect back on and say, why did no one ever suggest an assessment? And if they did suggest an assessment, my mum would have slapped it down because she was very quick to shroud anything like that in shame, despite being a nurse. And yes, when I think about these experiences, a lot of them will absolutely have been amplified by trauma. I can't underline enough how important it is to understand how much trauma impacts children and how that can mirror so many neurodivergent behaviours and things. But I have never related so much to the things that were on these assessment forms that I was filling in. And I recognise so many of these things within my own childhood. Like one of the things that I do, if you've ever seen any of my videos, I speak with my hands. I didn't know that that was stimming. I had no idea that that could be stimming. You could also just be somebody who speaks with their hands. But when I am not conscious of it and I step back from it and I'm doing it big time, so many of these signs were recognisable and were obvious. Things like having a baby bottle until I was about 4 because I was so clingy to it. My mum didn't really make the effort to take it off me, but used to use it as a way to be different, and would always tell me how embarrassed my grandparents were that I still had a bottle and how it was ridiculous, and she was the only one who would support me in having that for as long as I wanted, when actually I was going to school and then coming home and having that baby bottle after what you would have called kindergarten when I went to the little school, and it would now be kind of like pre-reception, preschool style age. That kind of regressive behaviour can be an indication of neurodivergence, along with everything else that was going on for me, but also can be a sign of trauma, but equally should never be something that we shame our children for. And when I look back on so many of these experiences, my mum would often engineer them and then shame me for them. And I just feel like a whole new level of failure has been added on top, that I could have all of these signs, show all of these ways in which I was overwhelmed as a child and needed additional support, be that just because of trauma or be that because of neurodivergence and trauma. And I keep saying be that just because of trauma, and I don't mean that dismissively. I do really want to highlight though how different it feels looking at it through the lens of neurodivergence. I feel almost like there's another betrayal that's come through. And I appreciate as well that education has come on so much. You know, you can't move now on social media without seeing some kind of informative post. We've really done great work in raising awareness. Sometimes it feels a little bit like people are over self-diagnosing, but is it any surprise when so many of us have been missed or made to feel that we should be ashamed for who we are and how we behave, when that links to neurodivergence, because neurodivergent children were considered weird, difficult, naughty? How many of you, if you're listening to this and you are neurodivergent, would relate to the phrase, well, she'd do really well at school if she could just focus? Like, no, that just feels so frustrating now. That feels so different and so frustrating now. And again, it almost feels like that, how I don't even know myself. I've done so much to try and get to know myself, and now I feel like I have to try and work out who I am all over again. And even things like when I would go and visit family, and I've again put this down to trauma, and I think I've spoken about it on the podcast before. When I would go and see family and they were in the Midlands, I would pick up their accents, and I have always done this. I did not know that that was a sign of neurodivergence. It is also a sign of trauma and a sign of fawning. However, to the level that I was doing it, it's much more likely that it was neurodivergence. And that just feels so frustrated, because I'd be laughed at for doing those things, and yet either way that you look at it, whether I was fawning and trying to create a personality because I was people pleasing and I was afraid of retribution or not being liked because I wasn't liked at home, or I was only liked when I was compliant, I was only liked when I fell into line, I was only loved when I was of use or when I was providing a source for my mother. If you look at it through that lens, it's sad. And then if you add the added layer of being neurodivergent, being autistic, or having ADHD, or both, because over 65% of people apparently who are autistic also have ADHD, which I didn't know until I started finding out more about this. If you look at it through that lens, it's even more sad. That's something that I physically couldn't help. That's something that I was doing in order to try and make people like me, on top of having all of this trauma. And I can't express how many people in the studies that I have researched are neurodivergent, who are a similar age to me and have experienced trauma and now have CPTSD. I joked to a friend the other day, I'm like a walking bloody alphabet. If I have ASD, ADHD and CPTSD, all I need now is a PhD. But we can all agree I appear to have woefully misinterpreted what the phrase collecting D meant in that, because it wasn't disorder. But here I am. And even as I'm recording this episode, there's an element of me that is thinking, God, will anyone relate to this? Will anyone understand what I'm saying? That added layer of frustration that you were left undiagnosed, that added layer of anger, that all of these signs were here, not just that you were a child experiencing trauma, but that you were a child who was neurodivergent, that you were an adolescent who was neurodivergent, that you were struggling in all of these ways. Where was the support? And that you were so shamed for it, and almost in a way still feel ashamed, like there's something not quite right with me yet again. And that's not because I think there's something not right with being neurodivergent. There is nothing wrong with being neurodivergent, but because I've been made to feel so ashamed of those elements of me, of those what people would have termed quirks or weirdness, when in fact they're not, but they do perhaps have an explanation. And that explanation certainly is not that I'm difficult or that I'm naughty or that I lack focus or that I'm weird or any of those things, but that explanation is that I'm neurodivergent. And as a result of being a neurodivergent child in a narcissistic household, I have an excess of trauma that I have experienced throughout the years. I'm sure there are so many people that will listen to this who would have been beaten because they did something that was different or considered difficult, but actually now we might be able to look at and go, yep, that's very, very classic of a neurodivergent teen or a neurodivergent child. That's not naughtiness, that was this, that was that. That's explained. Or they will have parents whose attitude would have been, we'll beat it out of you, be it verbally, physically, whatever that might have looked like for you, and we'll beat you into compliance, when your brain was just going, I don't know how to do that. What are they on about? See the world through this lens. And even now, as I'm saying that, I'm thinking of all the times that my husband has said to me, are you being deliberately difficult? Or do you not bloody well get what I am saying to you? And I'm like, I don't bloody well get what you're saying to me 90% of the time, my friend. But on this occasion, I do not have a clue what you are trying to say to me. And I totally don't get your point of view at all. And then enters the trauma side of things that goes, okay, well, you need to stay lovable. Don't push the button here. Say that you do understand and just let it be done and start fawning. And it's so frustrating to see how these experiences for me have collided in a way. And I'm hoping that someone out there will understand what I'm experiencing and how I'm feeling, because it's all very new to me. And as I said, this is coming at you from a very raw place, but it's such an additional layer. And while it's absolutely not to dismiss or diminish the neurotypical children who've experienced childhood trauma, not by any means, not even slightly, because trauma is trauma. All trauma is valid, whether you are neurodivergent or neurotypical. I do think that there will be a lot of people who will be similar age to me and only just now discovering that those things that their parents seem to truly hate about them were neurodivergent. That the thing that their parent tried so hard to beat out of them, again, physically, verbally, emotionally, however that correction may have taken place, will have been neurodivergence and will just have had absolutely no understanding whatsoever. And for those who experience the narcissistic parent, I feel like you become a whole different level of source for their narcissistic buzz, for that entertainment that they get from winding you up, from prodding, and for creating those feelings of being unlovable. I think it's so much easier to believe that you are unlovable when the world shows you or treats you that it thinks you're weird or you're different or you're othered. And that was certainly my experience growing up. And I think another layer here to talk about that I think is very important for neurodivergent people. Neurodivergence is so genetic. Okay, this is how I've ended up finding out that there is a big question mark over my own neurodivergence. It's so genetic with ADHD and with autism that you have, I think again, it was something like a 60% chance of having neurodivergent children if you are neurodivergent yourself. And it feels to me like a significant amount of the hatred, especially towards scapegoats, especially towards your only child, if that's the case, is a lot of projection and self-loathing. And it's raised some really interesting questions for me about my mum and her neurodivergence. I've had people message me online before when I've talked about my mum's trying to diagnose her and saying, well, it sounds like she's got this and you should be more understanding. And I want to highlight, regardless of whether you are neurotypical, neurodivergent, you have a personality disorder, it is never an excuse for abuse. There are people out there who have diagnosed NPD and they do their very best to work on their own experiences, to manage their personality disorder and to heal and prevent themselves from harming other people. There's never an excuse for being abusive. There's no but to this part of the podcast episode. There is just never an excuse for any of these things. And I think some of the uncomfortability is in if I am neurodivergent and that then reflects that perhaps one of my parents, if not both of my parents, are neurodivergent, is that then going to become another layer of the already, oh, well, they didn't know better? Is that then going to become, well, they were neurodivergent, so we'll excuse this? Or, you know, oh, well, that was maybe why she treated you the way she did because she didn't understand. Absolute bollocks. But it does make me question, is that going to be there? Also makes me question some of her behaviours and were they part of neurodivergence? Again, I want to reiterate that does not excuse it at all. But there's almost this kind of toxic hope that slithers in there and makes you think, well, was it as bad as I thought it was? Or have I made it worse? Because we're always prone to blaming ourselves because I'm neurodivergent. Have I made it worse? Which is, again, rubbish. I've not made it worse. It was as bad as it was. But also, did she not mean it? And if she knew she was autistic or had ADHD, would she have behaved differently? And again, absolutely not, because it's not an excuse. It's never an excuse. But all of these thoughts tumble through your brain and it feels so confronting. It's so much to take in and to take on all at once. And I think it's raised some really big questions. Anyone who is out there going through a late assessment, especially if you've experienced a significant amount of childhood trauma or any childhood trauma in the way that so many of us who listen to this podcast have, I just want you to know that you're not on your own, and that if so many of those thoughts are tumbling in, then that's okay. Because me too. And there's so many of those thoughts rummaging around my head now. I also want you to hold so firmly to the fact that neurodivergence, whether your parent was not an excuse for them to treat you the way that they did. If you are in fact neurodivergent, as I'm sure many people listening to this will be, whether you are diagnosed or not, or you just have suspicions or you're self-diagnosed, whatever that might mean for you, you do not treat your children that way. So how is it ever going to be an excuse for your parent? And I want you to really remember that. As I've already mentioned, this is really new for me. It's a new thing for me to be thinking about, talking about. So I am not going to be focusing on this at all. I just think it was an important episode, and I would love to speak to somebody who has had a formal late diagnosis and knows that they are either autistic or have ADHD, and the experience that they have had and how they felt about it coming into the realization that they are neurodivergent, but having had that childhood trauma impacting them as well, who's perhaps a little bit further down the line than me. I think that would be a really interesting episode for people to listen to and to see how the trauma of growing up neurodivergent in these toxic households with parents who would have treated you in a toxic manner regardless, but whose behaviour has been amplified by the neurodivergence and who have used the neurodivergence almost as a weapon to other and to shame. I think it'd be really healing. I would find it healing, certainly, and I think it would make for a really insightful episode. Thank you so much for listening. As always, you can find me over at Toby and Rue, or possibly by the time you listen to this at Harriet Shearsmith, because I am looking at changing some of my socials around. If you can't find me, you can search at Toby and Rue and it should come up, or at unfollowing_mum on Instagram and TikTok. Sending you all love and kindness. Speak soon. Bye.